Thank you for joining me today. We live in a time when our history is quickly disappearing, if not being rewritten in certain ways. And of course, young people usually wait until they're old enough that everyone who remembers the history is gone to start asking questions. I've set out to tell the stories of my community, but they're not unique to my community because they're the story of America in the 1800s. With that in mind, today I want to talk about the Panther Valley Murder Mystery. Now, this is a mystery that has been legend in my family since the day that the events took place. Um, It is something I've been interested in and have been privileged to research and to find some new insight on what exactly happened on that fateful day. It takes place in an area approximately 15 miles to the east of Springfield, Missouri, in what is now Webster County, nestled on the banks of the Panther Creek. It involves my family and many families that were pioneers in this area. My name's Greg Atkinson. I'm a lifelong resident of Webster County, Missouri, and this is the story. The account revolves around the story of this man, Samuel Bachman Barnard. He's buried in a small, unassuming grave in the Panther Valley Cemetery, which is very close to where I live. It's not the original stone, obviously. The original stones were likely moved or destroyed in a tornado that went through the cemetery in the mid-1960s. Later on, someone purchased a new stone. It was placed in roughly the area where they knew that Samuel and his wife Nancy had been buried, and it still resides there to this day. So let's talk about Samuel Bachman Barnard. Firstly, some sources have Samuel having 18 siblings. What we know for sure is he was born in Hawkins County, Tennessee in the year 1800. Now, he lost his father at a relatively young age. His father was a man by the name of John Barnard. He was drowned as he tried to ford the Holston River in eastern Tennessee when it was at flood stage. Now, we don't know a lot about John Barnard, and as a matter of fact, there were some people who thought that perhaps John was a son of a Revolutionary War soldier. However, it's come to light, at least in my research, that John may not have been as young as one might think when he drowned in the Holston River. As a matter of fact, it seems that Samuel Bachman might very well have been his youngest son, and that his father John had fought in the Revolutionary War beside 6 other of his brothers before moving to North Carolina and then into the Smoky Mountains in Tennessee. Now, after Samuel's father died, his mother and his siblings that were still left at home, they moved on west into what is now Roane County, Tennessee, to an area about 10 miles to the north of Kingston, Tennessee, a little hamlet village that at least was used to be known as Barnardsville. Now, it was called Barnardsville because it actually sat on land that was purchased by Samuel Bachman's brother John when he bought it from the U.S. government after they acquired it in a treaty with the Cherokee Indians. Now, when Samuel was grown, he went into business with a man by the name of Charles Bottom. They opened a store, and there, of course, they dealt in the day-to-day goods that were needed for survival in the foothills of the Smoky Mountains, along with commodity training. He also was a whiskey distiller, selling his own whiskey at 25 cents a pint, and he was also a tanner by trade. So I think you could definitely say that he was a man of many talents. So in 1821, Samuel Barnard was married to Nancy Jolly. They were married on June 10th of that year in Barnardsville, Tennessee. They were married by Nancy's sister's father-in-law, a man by the name of Bird Dethridge. Now, for many years, it was unknown exactly what Nancy's maiden name was. There were many who thought Nancy's maiden name was in fact Dethridge. But then, once the marriage license was found, it became really obvious that her last name was in fact Jolly. And from then on, we understood that her family was also a prominent family. Samuel and Nancy, just like his father before him, had quite the brood of children. As a matter of fact, it would seem that there were 14 children born to that union. The oldest was a girl by the name of Lucinda, although I can't find a whole lot of information on when she died or how old she was when she died. For most of my life, it was believed that Zedekiah was the first child. However, research seems to indicate that that was not the case. However, all of the children of Samuel and Nancy were born in Tennessee, except for the very youngest daughter, Martha C., who was actually born after they pioneered their way into southwest Missouri. Now, Samuel first moved his family when they left Tennessee to an area near the confluence of the James River and the Panther Creek. Now, this is very near to the church that they attended and were lettered to out of Tennessee, the Ozark Primitive Baptist Church. They had left Tennessee being members of the Shiloh Primitive Baptist Church there, and when they moved to Missouri, they became members at the Ozark Primitive Baptist Church. Amazingly enough, the Ozark Primitive Baptist Church is still gathering there to this day. There's still a congregation there. Now, it's not the original building, but it is in the original spot where that church had sat since 1840. Now, sometime around 1857, shortly before or shortly after, Samuel Barnard moved his family once again. This time, he moved his family to the dry fork of the Panther Creek, approximately 1.5 miles from where his original homestead was, as the crow flies. Now, once he was there, he had built a cabin, and this was built on land that he did not own. The land was actually owned by a friend of his, a man by the name of Samuel Caldwell. Now, we don't know for sure why Caldwell gave Barnard this place to build a homestead. I would assume that maybe Caldwell wanted Barnard to tend to the land, get it cleared, build a homestead where Caldwell might eventually move himself. However, that didn't happen. And the one thing that we know for certain is that it was never deeded to Samuel Bachman Barnard during his life. In fact, it was not until Nancy Barnard died that Samuel Caldwell deeded the land to their son Dudley, who lived there until the end of his life, and then the farm was eventually purchased by my great-great-grandfather Fountain Frazier, and it was eventually purchased once again by the Ewing family, and that area remains in their property to this very day. Now, the cabin was used with various additions up until the 1940s. And then sometime in the late 80s or early 1990s, it fell completely into disrepair and it collapsed. And you would think that would be the end of the story for this cabin. However, a man by the name of Thornton was helping to cut some wood and clear some brush out on the Ewing place, and he stumbled upon the wreckage of the Samuel Barnard cabin. And he asked the Ewings, "What are you going to do with this?" And they said, "If you want it, you can have it." And that's exactly what he did. He gathered it up, took it back to his home a few miles north of the original area, much nearer to Marshfield, Missouri, and there he rebuilt the Samuel Barnard cabin. This is the Samuel Barnard cabin as it looks today. I was privileged to go visit the cabin. Patsy Thornton, who is seen in the picture here, was gracious enough to let me come visit where her husband had rebuilt the cabin. She is seated next to a cousin of mine, a man by the name of Dan Barnard, and it's a really neat piece of history that I look forward to being able to visit and maybe spend even a little more time getting in touch with those memories of the past. I have several pictures actually of the cabin and my visit there. I just picked a couple for this presentation. However, I found this one interesting because it gives a little closer view of the logs to the inside of the house. You can also see the ladder that extended up into the loft, which would have been very important to those early settlers, having as many children as they did, to be able to sleep everyone in that one-room cabin. Here we have a picture of the fireplace that Mr. Thornton actually put into the cabin. The interesting thing about this is not that it's original at all, but they say that when you warm that cabin up with a fire in the wintertime, the whole cabin begins to smell like bacon. It always made me wonder how much bacon was prepared in the 100 and some odd year history that cabin was occupied. This is a view from the back of the cabin. You can see a lot of the way that the logs were hewn together to fit together perfectly. And to me, it's just a magical place because you really can feel a sense of the many memories that would have taken place within the confines of the cabin built of those logs. However, this peaceful looking cabin has a tragic story to tell. And that's what we're here to look at today. Because once they had settled, began to farm this area, something happened in this country that changed everything. The Civil War came to Panther Valley, and it changed everything. To understand what was going on in Missouri during the Civil War is to really understand the Civil War for all that it was. See, hostilities have been intense to the northwest of Panther Valley on the border of Kansas and Missouri since 1850. War would not have been, rumor of war would not have been a new thing to the Barnard family. In fact, as early as 1820, when Missouri was still beginning to take shape as a fledgling state, didn't actually become a state until 1821. However, there were things going on in Congress in preparation for that. One of these was an act called the Missouri Compromise. And what the Missouri Compromise did was it said that Missouri could come into the Union as a slave state. However, from that point on, any areas north of the 36-degree, 6-foot latitude line were automatically free states. Now, this was controversial even in its day because people knew the potential for it to cause conflict that it held. As a matter of fact, even Thomas Jefferson, the president, called it the death knell of the Union because he saw the fight that it was potentially going to cause. However, that's the way the law read it after 1820. So Missouri came into the Union as a slave state, and in 1846, a man took one of his servants with him on a trip to Wisconsin, and his slave escaped. And when he escaped, he was finally captured, and he said, "Whoa, you can't take me back to my master in Missouri because I escaped on free soil." This led to a huge case that we know today by that slave's name, a man by the name of Dred Scott. Now, this case went all the way to the Supreme Court. Before it was finally stricken down, the Supreme Court ruled against Dred Scott's owner, and he was returned to his master in Missouri. So this was a big conflict point as abolitionists had began to move into the Kansas territory. Then, in 1854, Congress passed the Kansas-Nebraska Act. This changed everything because the Kansas-Nebraska Act said that when Kansas territory went to join the Union, then it would be up to the people to choose whether or not they would be a slave state or a free state. Well, this caused a rush of abolitionists into Kansas to try to settle the land as quickly as possible to affect the vote in favor of Kansas being a free state. You at the same time had slave-owning Southern sympathizers from western Missouri also trying to cross into Kansas so they too could lay their claim, and this caused what we know today as Bleeding Kansas. Guerrilla fighting between the Jayhawker abolitionists in the Kansas territory and the Southern sympathizing bushwhackers in Missouri. Now back to Panther Valley. Samuel Barnard, we know, was definitely a Southern man. I'm not here to hash out all the details of the causes of the Civil War, and I'm certainly not here to defend the institution of slavery. There is no defense for that, but I am wanting to make sure that we can put ourselves in the shoes of the individuals, especially the victims, in this murder mystery. We know that Samuel Barnard was a slave owner. He had owned slaves when he was in Tennessee, and when he moved to Missouri, he had at least a few slaves. We know this for a couple of reasons. First of all, his sons that joined the Confederacy passed down to their children that when they joined, they were given manservants by their father to go with them to war. We also know that there was a slave, I believe by the name of Samson, who was one of Barnard's servants, who actually became a member of the Ozark Primitive Baptist Church where the family would have attended. So there's no doubt he was a slave owner. However, as we've talked about before, his father would have been a Revolutionary War soldier. So I'm sure that preserving the Union was something that Samuel Barnard would have loved to have seen happen. However, I'm sure that like many families in southwest Missouri when these hostilities began, the family tried to stay neutral. However, I think we can safely say that Samuel would have had Southern sympathies as being a pioneer. He would have been concerned with the idea that he might not be able to take his entire family, slaves included, if they moved west down the line. Well, these hostilities all came to a head with the election of 1860. When we think of the election of 1860, especially as a country, we remember the Lincoln-Douglas debates and the campaign that led to Abraham Lincoln becoming president. But what we don't usually remember is what was happening in Missouri at that time. Because in 1860, the state of Missouri elected this man to be their governor. This man was named Claiborne Fox Jackson. Now, he ran on the Democrat ticket, which most of the individuals in southwest Missouri would have been Southern Democrats. We know that Samuel Bachman Barnard certainly was. And he ran on a ticket claiming to be anti-secession. He claimed that he didn't want to see the state of Missouri leave the Union as other southern states were preparing to do. So he was sworn into office on January 3rd of 1861. On February 18th of 1861, there was a special state convention called to discuss and vote on the question of leaving the Union. Well, guess who showed up? Old Claiborne Fox Jackson. He was there and he was lobbying heavily for the state of Missouri to secede from the Union. So, when the Civil War finally began, President Lincoln issued a proclamation that every Union state should call up its militias and provide soldiers to the U.S. government to crush this rebellion. And Missouri was no different. They received a letter as well. So the question is, what was Jackson's response to this proclamation and letter sent from the newly elected President of the United States? Well, here it is. He said, your dispatch of the 15th instant, making a call on Missouri for 4 regiments of men for immediate service has been received. There can be, I apprehend, no doubt that the men are intended to form a part of the President's army to make war upon the people of the seceded states. Your requisition, in my judgment, is illegal, unconstitutional, and revolutionary in its object, inhuman and diabolical, and cannot be complied with. Not one man will the state of Missouri furnish to carry on any unholy crusade. So Jackson's response triggered him to do something that would really cause a stir. On May 3rd of 1861, Jackson ordered all Missouri militia to assemble in various places throughout the state for training. And one of these places was in St. Louis, and it was known as Camp Jackson. And that camp was almost fully comprised of Southern sympathizers and secessionists. And while these encampments were definitely legal for Jackson to establish, it got the Union's attention when they found that the Confederates had actually shipped weapons to St. Louis that had been captured in Baton Rouge, Louisiana from a federal arsenal. This got their attention in a big way. Once the Union noticed what it was that Jackson was doing, they sent this man, General Nathaniel Lyon, who was the commander of the pro-Union Home Guard, to go do something about this. What he did was he surrounded Camp Jackson and he took the entire militia prisoner. Well, this caused quite a ruckus, because as they were marching them to the arsenal to keep them there until they figured out what to do with them, a riot broke out in the streets. There were 2 days of rioting, lots of gunfire, several people were killed, and this caused the Missouri legislature to call for a bill that divided the state into military districts. And it also authorized a state guard. So, in response to this act of legislature, Claiborne Fox Jackson on May 11, 1861, appoints this man, Sterling Price, as a major general of the Missouri State Guard. Now, in theory, Missouri State Guard was promised to the Union, but it seems that Claiborne Fox Jackson had already sent envoys to Jefferson Davis asking him to please send the troops in Arkansas north to invade Missouri and help them secede from the Union. Well, when Nathaniel Lyon caught wind of this, on June 13th of 1861, he marched on Jefferson City, and with his troops, he ran Jackson and the pro-Confederate government out of the state of Missouri, or out of Jeff City. They fled south. And then on July 22nd of 1861, the Missouri State Convention reconvened, this time under Union rule in Jefferson City, and they voted against secession. So the state of Missouri was going to remain in the Union. On July 31st, so roughly 6 months from Claiborne Fox Jackson being put into office, the governor's office was declared vacant, and this man, Hamilton R. Gamble, was made the provisional governor of the state of Missouri. By August 30th, so a month later, John C. Fremont, in response to all the guerrilla fighting that was going on throughout Missouri, issued an edict that declared martial law in Missouri. So from that point on, everyone was under the command of the provisional government of the state of Missouri. What too many people don't realize is that after the provisional government was put in place and military rule began in Missouri, the remainder of the war for the Confederates were just different actions that were taken trying to rout the Federals and put the duly elected government back into place in Jeff City. And, you know, like I said, I'm not here to hash out all the reasons for the Civil War, but when you take all that in its context, it becomes obvious why so many people, especially amongst Southern sympathizers, referred to the Civil War as the War of Northern Aggression. After all, they had cast their government out of its duly elected post and created martial law. Now, after several battles like the Battle of Carthage, First Battle of Springfield, Wilson's Creek, where Nathaniel Lyon became the first general to die in the Civil War in battle, the Confederates eventually were mostly pushed out of Missouri. By 1862, Webster County was a Union stronghold. They had a large military presence there, and everyone answered to the provost marshal. Primarily, the Confederate presence consisted only of roving bands of guerrilla fighters that we know of today as the Bushwhackers. So, what was happening back on Panther Creek? In this part of the country, opinions were very divided, even amongst the Barnard family. I've often wondered what debates at the dinner table might have looked like. I would say that it probably got fairly intense from time to time. And we know that they were divided in their loyalties because of who the family went to fight for. Samuel and Nancy Barnard had a grandson by the name of Oliver Ewing, pictured here in the center of this photo, which is about the clearest photo that I actually have of Oliver Ewing, surrounded by a lot of his family. But he was actually the son of the oldest daughter in Missouri of Samuel and Nancy Barnard, Diana. She was married to a man named James Ewing, and their son Oliver was born in 1840. Now, when he joined the military, he was mustered into Company E of the 8th Missouri Cavalry Union. Now, Union records have him being a nurse in a war hospital in Springfield. He became a corporal in November of 1862, but his duties weren't limited to nursing. In fact, we read that he was a scout and that he also saw action in some different places. Now, his family actually grew up not far from my home, and his father actually owned land where I actually lived as a child near the Wester Bluff on the Panther Creek. So, interestingly enough, Samuel had at least this one grandson who became a Union soldier. Now, his father, James, eventually became a Union soldier, but not until 1864, after the events of today's story had already taken place. Samuel Barnard also had two sons who joined the Confederate Army. Both Samuel E. Barnard, who was born in 1841, and his brother Henry Purvis Barnard, who was born in 1842, actually joined the 4th Missouri Cavalry Confederate. Only one of them would return from the war. This is my great grandfather, Henry Purvis Barnard, seen in his cavalry uniform once he joined the Army. He was actually wounded during the war. According to his pension papers, he was wounded in the flesh of his left leg in the Battle of Cape Girardeau, which took place on April 26th of 1823. Now, Samuel Barnard was captured after the Second Battle of Lexington in Lexington, Missouri, and he later died of the wounds that he took there in the Jefferson Barracks prison, which the cemetery is still there to this day. Interesting side note about Samuel and Purvis Barnard. Samuel E. Barnard was engaged to Lucy Compton when he joined the cavalry. After he was captured and subsequently died in prison, Henry Purvis went home and eventually married his brother's fiancée, and they became my great-grandparents. So if it hadn't been for the events of the Battle of Lexington and the death of Samuel E. Barnard, I wouldn't even exist. Kind of an interesting side note. But needless to say, there were a couple of obviously differing opinions amongst the family within the Barnard household. Some quick background on the 4th Missouri Cavalry Confederate. It was originally formed by this man in the picture here, a man by the name of William O. Coleman. He had fought in the Battle of Wilson's Creek, and after that battle took place, he took it upon himself to raise a regiment to fight for the South in Missouri. And from that cause arose the 4th Missouri Cavalry Confederate. It was comprised almost completely, at least in the beginning, of bushwhackers who wanted to become legitimate soldiers in this war. And because of this bushwhacker attachment, the Union actually arrested Coleman's wife and daughter and kept them under guard in the city of Rolla until the end of the war. This didn't stop Coleman's pursuits, though, because he led the cavalry through battles such as South Fork, West Plains, Little Piney, and the Battle of Hartville. But something happened in 1863 which threw all that into distress, because the Confederate leaders ordered all Southern Army units in Missouri to go into Arkansas and to regroup there. Coleman refused to do this. And because he refused to do this, his commission was taken away. He was arrested and then finally released a few weeks later. However, his unit, the Missouri 4th, was actually handed over to different leaders who built it, and it actually became a much larger unit because of that. So during the war, it would seem that Henry Purvis and his brother Samuel would have fought under the leadership of this man. This is Colonel John Q. Burbridge. And at the time, Henry, pictured here at the left, was 19, and his brother Samuel was just 21 years old. This leads us to the date in question, May 31st of 1863. This picture was taken on May 31st of 2020, looking down the valley of the Dry Fork of the Panther Creek toward the homestead of Samuel and Nancy Barnard on the date of May 31st. So I always picture it as a beautiful late spring. We know it was a Sunday morning. Perhaps Samuel and Nancy took the family to church. Maybe after their chores were done, they went down to the creek and enjoyed dipping their feet into the cool water. We'll just never know. What we do know for sure is that by the end of that fateful day, Samuel Bachman Barnard was dead, and a legend was born, because the story was passed down through the generations to where we sit today discussing it. But it was first recorded in print by a man by the name of Noble Ney, who was actually one of my great uncles, in his book, The Barnard Family, 1604 to 1954. In the early 1950s, Noble Ney's research really brought to light a lot of history that was about to be lost even in the 50s concerning the Barnard legacy. He was actually married to my Grandma May's sister. Her name was Max Barnard, and she was a granddaughter of Henry Purvis Barnard, who, of course, was the son of Samuel Barnard that fought and returned home from the war and was with the 4th Missouri Cavalry. Now, Noble Ney traveled the country extensively, tracking down information concerning the family. My Uncle Dan claimed that he had put somewhere around 50,000 miles on his brand new car by the time that he was done doing his research. And he was looking for answers everywhere that he could find, even in the archives in Washington, D.C. He was trying to find these records. And this is the account that he records of what happened on May the 31st, 1863. He says, on May the 31st of 1863, Samuel Barnard died. From the storybook is the following quotation. Samuel Barnard was killed the last 31st day of May, 1863, and was buried on the first day of June. Today, his gravestone may still be found in the Panther Valley Cemetery in Webster County. The stone is a rough field stone, a very soft material. The name and date of birth only appear on it, and the date of death does not appear. Again, going back to the handwritten record of the store, it is conclusively proven that he died on the above date. According to Henry Barnard and others, the cause of death was by the famed and ill-reputed Missouri bushwhackers. They stopped at what is now the Ed Atkinson place. The neighbor woman that lived there informed the bandits that Samuel Barnard was harboring the enemy. Then the outlaws went down to the house of Samuel. Hoping to rob them of their ill intent, Nancy Barnard cooked dinner for the group in order to pacify them. However, this was to no avail, for the bushwhackers took Samuel just north of his home to the first bluff, which is near the present-day road, and they tied him to a tree there and shot him. Another report has it that he was made to kneel by the tree, and still another report claims that he was expecting the bushwhackers that night and that his family attempted to persuade him to hide before they came. To this, he is reported to have said that he had only one time to die. To add insult to injury, the outlaws ordered two of the daughters to guard the body until morning. Then they left, never to be caught for this foul deed. So that's the story as it's been recorded for the family and others interested parties to read since 1955. However, family history comes with some hiccups. One of these hiccups is that Noble Nate was convinced that it was the Dalton gang that was to blame for Samuel Barnard's murder. However, history shows us that the Dalton gang's reign of terror it lasted from 1890 to 1892. Most of the members of the Dalton gang hadn't even been born yet. So I think the first thing that we can conclusively prove is that the Dalton gang were not involved in the murder of Samuel Barnard. Now, my own research has been a lot easier than it was in Noble Nate's day, because certainly with the internet, you can find all kinds of valuable information if you're just willing to dig. I've used Ancestry.com extensively, Find a Grave, along with every essay and historical document that I've been able to pull up. I've read and taken and gleaned what I could from them. There have been many records that have been made by different authors and autobiographers throughout the years. And of course, historians and record keepers have done a wonderful job of housing these priceless records in these different historical societies to kind of bring us back into the time where the events took place and better understand what was going on. There are also some writers who were researching different biographical accounts and compared those memories to the actual records to see where they might have been lacking some. Now, personally, I was able to visit Roane County, Tennessee, which I will do again, hopefully in the very near future. But I was able to visit with historian Robert Bailey there in Kingston, Tennessee. And he led me to a lot of information about the Barnard family and their time that they spent in Barnardsville. And it's amazing to me, there's a completely different history there of the time that they spent in Barnardsville. there were also several other families that migrated to the Panther Creek area in the 1840s and early 1850s. There's correspondence between them back to family members at home in Barnardsville. So there's been an extensive amount of research done on trying to find out who these people were, what was important to them, and who they left behind. Now, on top of that, I can't but point out that my Uncle Dan has also been a great help to me in this research. He's researched a lot of these events himself and family history, and he has been able to gently nudge and push me along to find some of these answers that otherwise I might have not even looked for. So with all that research in mind, how can we figure out who actually killed Samuel Bachman Barnard? Well, the first thing that we need to do is we need to return back to the homestead of the Barnards and discuss a situation that had really began to cause Samuel some serious trouble at the time. You see, Samuel Barnard's place, besides being a good farm, it also had another side gig, if you will. There were lead mines on the Barnard farm. One good source of income was found in these rich deposits of lead in the limestone, and it runs almost in a vein from the old, what they call the old lead belt, all the way to the area where Panther Creek runs. There were several of these mines, and my great grandfather, he actually came to Missouri and into Panther Valley for the purpose of mining these mines. So it was a great source of income, and Samuel Barnard certainly had some of them on his property. I was actually privileged to visit one of these lead mine shafts, one of the last ones that I know of that I was shown when I was a child, and I took a few photos. Now, this lead mine is on private property. It's not far off the road. If you don't know where it's at, it's going to be very difficult to find, although it can be seen from the blacktop. But it's a good sized mine. This is an air shaft that goes from the top of the bluff where the entrance is carved in into the floor of the cave or the mine. This is looking up through the shaft and out the top of the lead mine. This is part of the dugout area of the mine. You can tell that human hands have worked this mine to take that lead ore out of it. This picture I put on here because it's just amazing the way that it came out. This is looking back at the air shaft and the light coming down through it onto the ground of the lead mine itself. Here's another photo of walking through part of the mine where you can see that it's actually veers off in a couple of different directions. So the question boils down to, what do the lead mines have to do with anything? Well, it would seem that Samuel had been accused by one or more of his neighbors of occasionally allowing the bushwhackers to hole up in his lead mines from time to time. Now, the lead mine that I was in, it was definitely big enough to house as many as maybe even 50 or 60 soldiers in a pinch. It would have been a warm place to hide in the winter. It would have been cool in the summertime, and it would have been a great place to disappear if you were on the run. So you remember this guy, I hope. This is William O. Coleman, the original founder and organizer of the 4th Missouri Cavalry that 2 of Samuel Barnard's sons actually joined with. But if you'll remember, we talked about the fact that Coleman had been relieved of his duty and even arrested in early 1863 for refusing to leave the state of Missouri. After all, he had signed up to fight for his home state, and his wife and daughter were still imprisoned in Rolla, and he was not willing to take the war elsewhere. So what did Coleman do when he was released from his imprisonment? Well, we know that he organized a band of guerrillas, and for the remainder of the war, he roamed the Union-occupied territory between Springfield and Rolla. So Samuel Barnard had to do something about these allegations. So what he did was he asked his neighbor, John Yandle, and his grandson, Oliver Ewing, to ride into Marshfield and swear affidavits that Samuel was not harboring bushwhackers in his lead mines. And you'll see these 2 copies of old parchment that are very hard to read. These are the actual photocopies of the preserved affidavits that were signed and sworn by both John Yandle and Oliver Ewing. So luckily, one of my distant cousins has taken the time to transcribe these affidavits. This is the affidavit of John Yandle to the best that we can read it. He says, I live in Webster County, Missouri. Mr. Samuel Barnard sent his son to my house to get me to go with him to Marshfield to report the guerrilla bands in his neighborhood. And in parentheses, it's hard to tell. We believe it says, as Southern men. He then says, I went with him to Marshfield. I heard him report them to the military authorities at that place, and he had done right in doing so. Barnard bears a good character in his neighborhood. I don't know of him harboring guerrilla bands or aiding them in any manner. He has always been against the marauding bands. Signed with an X, his mark, John Yandle. It says then that it was subscribed and sworn to before me this 21st of August, 1862, M.L. Kink, and we believe it's lieutenant to the provost marshal general. So we believe that is who this was sworn to. We also have Oliver Ewing's affidavit transcribed for us. Listen to what he says. He says, I live in Webster County, Missouri. Mr. Barnard came to my house to get me to go to Marshfield with him to report a party of men had been at his house and was, we assume, representing themselves as part of Coleman's guerrilla band. Now remember Coleman. We assume this is the Coleman that Oliver Ewing claims was part of the guerrilla band that had been in the area. Says he got a young lady who, it looks like they've X'd out lives and inserted was, at my house to go and report it, though through the neighborhood. I have heard him say he didn't want any of the guerrilla parties to come about him. He is always something, himself as being very much opposed to them. I have heard him say, tell his boys not to violate their oaths, but to live up to them. I can only assume that what Oliver Ewing is saying here is that Samuel Barnard had told his 2 sons, Purvis and Samuel, to not become guerrilla fighters, not to go into bushwhacking, but to keep their vows to the Confederate Army. So this leads us to our first big question or what if when it comes to why was Samuel Barnard killed. And the what if is this: did Samuel Barnard, as so many other Southern sympathizing Missourians did during that time, at least on occasion, allow different guerrilla bands to be harbored and take in provisions and be cared for maybe during the winter months in these lead mines? Now, the photo in the center here is actually taken at the mouth of the Smallin Civil War Cave in Ozark, Missouri, which is also a place where soldiers would take refuge. We have to remember that in Samuel Barnard's day, there wasn't a strong, legitimate Confederate presence. And if you were a Southern sympathizer and you wanted to give aid to your side, the only ones there to receive it would have been guerrilla fighters, bushwhackers. So there's a good chance, in my opinion, that probably this was something that Samuel Barnard had in fact done from time to time during the war. Things have become very dangerous for Samuel. Samuel Barnard, after these accusations were made, he knew that he could be hung at any time. This is actually the gallows at Fort Smith, Arkansas, if you've never been there. But you can imagine there was probably something similar in Marshfield, Missouri, for those who differed in opinion from the Union. Samuel had to think about his wife and his family and try to avoid as many conflicts with the Union authorities as he possibly could. I would say that it's safe to assume that he decided after those affidavits were signed that he was going to avoid any activity which might leave him vulnerable. However, there were events playing out in the war that Samuel could have never anticipated and that I believe led to his subsequent murder. You see, early in 1863, an event took place that may very well have set the course for Samuel's demise. You see, after the Battle of Prairie Grove in January of 1863, some Union soldiers from the 8th Missouri Cavalry went down to Huntsville, Arkansas, and they took 9 Southern sympathizers from a guardhouse in the Mason's Lodge there in that city, and they led them to a farm about a mile away from the city, and there they murdered them in cold blood. History records that it was probably in retaliation for the killing of 18 federal troops in November of 1862, very near to Huntsville. However, we don't know for sure what prompted this massacre. What we do know is that the Huntsville massacre caused every bushwhacker in Arkansas and in Missouri to put a hefty price on the head of anyone who was a part of the 8th Missouri Cavalry Union. So when all the chaos of all this information that was coming in and that I was learning more about, a new suspect began to emerge. You see, one day I was having a conversation with my Uncle Dan, and we were discussing the Samuel Barnard murder, and I simply asked him if there were any real suspects that he had ever heard about. And his only words to me was that I should check out the autobiography of this man. Meet Samuel Hildebrand. Now, Hildebrand was a well-known bushwhacker. He was born in eastern Missouri, and in his time he was probably as well known as individuals like William Quantrill or Bloody Bill Anderson. And he was obviously a very self-promoting kind of individual. He actually dictated his biography to a couple of ghostwriters who actually wrote it down in defense of his bushwhacking during the war. Now, this biography or autobiography was actually written about 10 years after the war ended. Well, you might say, well, why does that make him a suspect? Well, here is where it gets interesting. Because the 21st chapter of his autobiography bears this title. It's titled, "Started with 6 men for Springfield, Missouri, deceived by a federal spy, was captured through mistake by rebels, surprised on Panther Creek, returned home on foot." So what does Samuel Hildebrand claim happened on Panther Creek? Well, I wonder if he spoke as poetically as this is written, but here's what his book records. He says, "When sable light again clad the wicked world in half mourning, we resumed our journey, and on approach of day, we were in the beautiful little town of Vera Cruz in Douglas County. On the next night, we reached Panther Creek in Webster County. One of our men, who professed to be acquainted in that neighborhood, went to a pretended rebel friend to get supplies, but the old fellow flatly refused to give him anything. I was a little amused at the disappointment of the boys and at the dilemma in which they were placed. I could not help thinking how different I would have acted on a raid of my own." Now, the only real issue with this account is that Hildebrand claims that it took place in 1864, a year after Samuel Barnard was murdered. However, we have to remember that Hildebrand is writing this, he's dictating this 10 years after the war took place. And in 2005, Kirby Ross actually went through and edited the autobiography of Samuel Hildebrand. He went and he checked all of these things that Hildebrand claimed happened against records of the Union Army and any record that could be found. And Kirby Ross came to the conclusion that some of it just wasn't actually as factual as Hildebrand made out. So what Kirby Ross found is that there was no record on the Confederate or the Union side of any skirmish taking place on Panther Creek in Webster County. However, what there is evidence of is a skirmish that took place on Panther Creek in Osceola. Now, the difference is very important because the events that played out in Osceola actually led to Samuel Hildebrand's group being routed by Union soldiers, having to flee on foot, but it took place on May the 22nd of 1863. As a matter of fact, the Union record says the next day, which was May 22nd, 1863, we came upon a band of rebels on Panther Creek near Osceola. They approached within 75 yards of them and opened fire. Without returning fire, the rebels sought safety by running. This has always led me to a piece of what I would call very convincing circumstantial evidence. And that evidence boils down to, did Samuel Hildebrand, recording his story of the war, 10 years after it ended, accidentally put together two events because they bore the same name. In other words, was Hildebrand in fact, as the Union claims, routed on May the 22nd, 1863, 9 days before the murder of Samuel Barnard, and forced to flee on foot, and in his fleeing came to another Panther Creek, this time in Webster County, which he documents exactly the county where this took place, where this seeming friend of the rebels flat refused to give them any aid. Which brings us to what I believe happened on the night in question. I believe that the murder of Samuel Barnard all rested on a chance encounter. You remember the story as Noble Nay recorded. He said not only do Henry Barnard and others say that the death was caused by the bushwhackers, he also records that they stopped at what is now the Ed Atkinson place. The neighbor woman that lived there informed the bandits that Samuel Barnard was harboring the enemy. The next logical question then is, who could the enemy have been that Samuel Barnard was accused of harboring? Well, you'll remember Samuel Barnard had a grandson, Oliver Ewing, who was part of the 8th Missouri Cavalry. Well, what was Oliver Ewing doing during this week or so ahead of the murder of his grandfather? Well, according to Union records, Oliver Ewing, Corporal, Company E, 8th Missouri Cavalry, who worked at Fort 1 in Springfield, Missouri, was on May 26, 1863, absent on scout duty. So he had left Springfield, Missouri on scout duty. My question is, what if 5 days before his grandfather was killed, Oliver had come to visit the old folks, and the neighbor woman had caught wind of it? And perhaps on that day it was all very innocent. So now that we have all the pieces in place, let's put this puzzle together and figure out what we think really did happen on that fateful day by the dry fork of the Panther Creek. I believe that Samuel and Nancy had enjoyed a visit from their grandson Oliver early in the week. And May 31st of 1863 likely dawned beautifully, like so many other Southwest Missouri late spring days. But even in all this beauty, there was a perfect storm that was brewing that was going to leave Samuel Barnard's life in the pages of history and legends in Panther Valley. I believe that earlier in the day, Samuel Hildebrand and his men had arrived in the area, and he had sent some of his men to find provisions to last them till they could return into Arkansas. I also believe that Samuel Barnard, in fear of being arrested and potentially hung for helping the bushwhackers, refused to offer assistance, and he sent them away. The men returned to Hildebrand, and they told him of their predicament. And perhaps early on, Hildebrand really did shrug it off and plan to leave. However, they really needed supplies, and he was always on the lookout for people who might be harboring the enemy. So as the bushwhackers prepared to head further south, they just happened to stop at Samuel Barnard's neighbor's home. Perhaps the conversation was very simple. You wouldn't know where we might be able to find some provisions, ma'am. We are traveling back home after being routed up north by the Yankees. She may have answered, it's too dangerous here, and I don't know whether or not I can give you any provisions. Samuel Barnard was accused of giving aid to the enemy, and he had to stop that out of fear. So maybe they said, we can understand that, ma'am. You wouldn't happen to know anybody who might be harboring the enemy. And maybe they didn't even ask. Maybe she just said, Samuel Barnard's had a visit from his grandson. He's a Union man. Well, what regiment does he ride with? Oh, well, he's part of the 8th Missouri Cavalry out of Springfield. And upon hearing that, the entire stage was set. I'm sure the sound of horses broke the silence in the spring night. I've often imagined what it must have been like to live in what today is a peaceful area here in southwest Missouri during this conflict. If you woke to the sound of horses, you would have had to immediately question, is it friend? Is it foe? Is it someone who's wanting to hurt me? Is it someone who wants to take what I have? As a matter of fact, there's other stories in the countryside here in this very area where it is claimed that some settlers had just taken to killing any soldier that came near their farm. They lay in wait and would ambush them. Didn't care if they were Union, didn't matter if they were Confederate. They just knew that anybody was out to take what was theirs. And it would have definitely have been a scary time. But the horses or the footsteps or whatever of these men would have definitely caused a fear in the Samuel Barnard household. Knowing the danger that they were in, Samuel had his wife Nancy cook them a large meal to try to keep them from being too angry. Perhaps while it was being prepared, they all sat at the family table. Maybe they discussed the current issues of the day. Maybe they talked about the way things used to be. After all, in a different time, they could have been friends. They were both Southern sympathizers. Perhaps after the dinner was eaten, Hildebrand would have stood up and said, well, I guess we should be going. Maybe he walked a little toward the door and turned back and said, yeah, I have one more question. Samuel Barnard might have said, yeah, what's that? Hildebrand might have responded, do you have a visitor this past week? Barnard, being an honest man, said, yes, actually, my grandson has been visiting us. Oh, would that be the grandson that's part of those murdering Union men and Yankees of the 8th Missouri Cavalry? And I always imagine that the old Southern sympathizing Samuel Barnard might have just hung his head and said, you can't change your children's opinions. All you can do is love them. And then they might have looked at Samuel and said, let's take a ride. Samuel's daughters may have been following after Hildebrand and their grandfather or their father in tow, and may have been pleading for his life as they went. Now, we'll never know exactly how Samuel Barnard reacted to all this. Of course, Noble Nay says that some accounts have him sitting at the door saying, only have one day to die. Although I think that's probably putting a little bit of a mythological spin on the actual events of that day. However, I doubt that he was wailing and begging and pleading for his life. I always picture Samuel Barnard maybe being a little bit like me. Maybe he thought, I can talk myself out of this one. I'll keep appealing to their sense of Southern hospitality. They're just going to scare me. He probably started to wonder where this was all going when they had him kneel before the tree or tied him to the tree, his daughter's still in tow, begging for their old father's life. Perhaps Hildebrand took his rifle that he called Kill Devil, out of his saddlebag. Perhaps he aimed it at Samuel Barnard's head and announced, "You've been accused of harboring the enemy and have been sentenced to die." And then it went down in history. I may never know what my grandfather Samuel Bachman Barnard looked like. After all, there's no pictures that I'm aware of the man in his life. But I do believe that we are looking at the portrait and potentially the rifle of the very man who put Samuel Barnard in his grave on May the 31st, 1863. I want to thank you all for joining me. I hope that this has been interesting, and I hope that if you've ever wondered about something in history that's happened to one of your own family, that you'll take the time to research. Take the time to find the answers. After all, once history's forgotten, it's gone for good. Thank you once again. Thanks again for watching. I am actually very interested in preserving not only my history, but also the cemetery where so many of my loved ones are buried. The Panther Valley Cemetery has over 700 interments, but it is maintained and taken care of solely by donations. My hope is that before my life is over, we might have this perpetually funded. If you would like to make a donation, you can send it to the mailing address on the side of your screen, the Panther Valley Cemetery, care of Dina Vineyard, and that's 6688 State Highway B, Rogersville, Missouri, 65742. Thanks once again, and I hope you have a great day.